Ahoy hoy shippies. Have you ever stopped for a moment to think about water? It is absolutely crucial to maintain life. The adult human body consists of around 60% of the nourishing liquid. It's in our blood, our spit, our organs. It cools us down, lubricates our joints, transports nutrients, and so much more. Without water we die, and it is constantly expended through urinating, excreting, sweating, and even just breathing. Naturally, this means that humans can last without water longer or shorter, depending on their activity. A sedate individual might survive a week or little more, but a sailor was expected to be constantly at work. He might only last a few days, and in the tropics, even just hours. However, humans are not the only beings to draw life from water. It is also the life source of many creatures harmful to us. A water source can be considered safe if it is continuously refilled from a fresh source, but it becomes dangerous if pollutants infect it, or if the source is stagnant. It is not moving. Stagnant water becomes a hotbed of insects, algae, and bacteria. Consumption of contaminated water can lead to the contraction of horrific diseases like cholera, typhoid, diarrhea, and dysentery. And humans have throughout history grappled with the issue of acquiring clean water. Settlements were constructed in proximity to it, pollutants had to be avoided, and if going on a journey, by land or sea, you had to plan it around the limited supply you could take with you. There is a long-standing idea that people back in the day drank alcohol instead of water. It is not entirely true, but not entirely false. In ancient times, the Romans could supply their cities with the aqueducts, but these fell into disrepair as antiquity gave way to the Middle Ages. However, people would still live close to the sources of clean water, usually rivers. Houses were built on beds of gravel or loam, where shallow wells could provide ample hydration. Populations were generally so low and distributed over large areas that there was no contamination. In 13th century London, the first great conduit was constructed. This was an underground system that provided fresh water to the city. Its head was placed near a natural spring, and was used to fill a nearby cistern. Water flowed from the cistern via pipes for a few kilometers distance, and water was extracted from the pipes through lead tanks placed in the middle of the streets, with taps for dispensing it. It wasn't until many centuries later that lead was found to be poisonous. Either way, by the 17th century, the city was watered by 15 of these conduits. However, as populations grew and industry expanded in the transition from medieval to early modern age, drinking water in major cities like London became increasingly contaminated. Water was relatively safe in the western part of the city before it flowed through the densely populated core. Here it picked up raw sewage, dead animals, and industrial waste, all pouring into the River Thames. People would dump their waste into the streets, and though rainwater did clear it, the resulting floods of rubbish flowed right into the river. Rain was a source of clean water for many, and large barrels were always placed into the street to collect it. Of course, water was not only used for drinking, but for industry, washing clothes, bathing, and as a rule, people in London did not drink water. Instead, people drank wine, usually beer. Most common was a weak beer, also called small beer, also given to children. One common misconception is that the alcoholic content purified the liquid from bacteria, but this is not the case. Period beer, if kept in improper conditions for a long time, would grow as foul as regular water. The reason was that beer simply had too low an alcoholic content to make it sterile, and the reason it was safer than the water it was made from was that the water had been boiled. It wasn't until germ theory in the mid-19th century that the reasons why boiling water made it safe to drink became well known. And it is disputed if it was just common knowledge before then and something people did without knowing the scientific reasons. Evidence for or against it is scarce in period documents. The ancients recommended boiling water to make it safe, but it is uncertain if this was known to the average 17th century person. Saying that it makes sense or that they must have known isn't enough evidence, because things that make sense to us, such as not using lead for water storage, did not make sense before the 1970s, in this case. And both history and contemporary times are full of examples of people doing actively harmful things out of ignorance. Clean water was one of the biggest concerns for planning a voyage by sea. Ships of the period were much smaller than nowadays and had to carry weapons, men and cargo, so space for fresh water was limited. A journey had to be planned around it, how much the crew needed, how much they could take aboard, and places where they could refill. By the age of sail, sailors had pretty much figured out how much water was needed for a voyage of any length. You simply took how much water a person needed per day, took that times the number of men aboard, and that times the estimated length of the voyage. Aboard a ship, you could expect 1 gallon of water a day. In the case of shortage, the ration could be procedurally lowered. A buccaneer named Basil Ringrose documented how the ration aboard his ship first began at 3 pints and a half. 2 months later, it had shrunk to half a pint. A gallon of water a day might seem like a lot, but according to Harvard Health, it is a little above the recommended daily intake for the average man. But this recommendation also includes the water you ingest from fruits, vegetables, coffee, tea, etc., with the recommendation that you drink between 4 to 6 cups of plain water each day. However, the dosage varies from person to person, and most importantly, how active you are. Sailors were very active, and pirates were in the tropics, where the hot temperature makes you sweat more. Provisions were usually dried, and food was typically salty. Very salty. The more salt you consume, the more water you need, and sailors often complain in their journals of being thirsty. Fresh fruit was limited, and though pirates in the Caribbean ate it more than other sailors, the fruit would still spoil after just a few days. So the large water ration was basically a way for them to compensate for the amount of water which we nowadays ingest in our food, which isn't as dry or as salty. Fresh water aboard a ship wasn't only for the men to drink. Officers received additional water for washing, though hygiene varied among the common men. Ships usually kept live animals aboard, fresh food you know, and though they were only allowed enough water to survive, a pig or even a cow needs more water than a man. Water was also used in cooking. Preserved foods such as dried legumes, dried or salted meat had to be steeped in fresh water. The legumes and dried meat to make it soft enough to be edible or cookable, and the salted meat to drain away the excess salt. It was literally covered in it, and even after soaking, it would still be very salty. This also means that seawater was not recommended for cooking. It was only done when fresh water was in short supply. Even today it is not recommended to use seawater for basically any sort of cooking, partly due to the salt content, but also due to pollutants. It was customary for the cook to take a pint of water from every man's freshwater ration and use that in the cauldron. Most of the food on the ship was boiled or prepared into a stew. It is of course a great irony for sailors to die of thirst when surrounded by a wasteland of water. The salt content in seawater is too much to make it safe for consumption. According to the National Ocean Service, the salt content in seawater is much higher than what can be processed by the human body. The page further explains that human kidneys can only make urine that is less salty than salt water. Therefore, to get rid of all the excess salt taken in by drinking seawater, you have to urinate more water than you drank. Eventually, you die of dehydration, even as you become thirstier. A lot of people discussing historical drinking water do so with a belief that humans are inherently rational and have access to vast repertoires of knowledge. I'm sure that in 400 years, people will still say the same about us, and despite us having unlimited access to information, people still do dumb shit. And it was of course even more common back in the day. Just because there is an optimal way of doing things doesn't mean that people have the savvy to do it. All of this to say that there are incidents of desperate pirates drinking seawater, with the following written by Raveneau de Lussan. One of our men, being greatly afflicted both with hunger and thirst at the same time, drank so much salt water that he died of it. Most of our men vomited continually, whether it were that they were incommoded with the water that got into them when they fell into the sea, as it will happen if they drink it out of mere necessity. This doesn't mean that seawater didn't have any purposes aboard a sail ship. It was used for putting out fires and for putting out smoking pipes. Seawater was used for cleaning dishes, clothing, the decks of the ship, and the people aboard. Naturally, clean water was better for all of these purposes, and women who were brought aboard as laundresses were always suspected of pilfering fresh water for cleaning. So fresh water was used for a lot aboard a sail ship. All of this had to be accounted for when planning the voyage, but things would often go horribly awry. Ships back then were dependent on the wind in order to sail, and depending on the weather, the voyage could be hampered or come to a complete halt. No winds meant that you couldn't move. On the opposite end, storms were dangerous to sail in. Contrary winds slowed you down and could even throw you off course, and suddenly you would be at sea for longer than expected. In 1786, a voyage between Mexico to Jamaica was not expected to take more than a few weeks, but ended up taking 14, and water had to be rationed after 3. Other incidents might rob the ship of the expected water. The aforementioned Basil Ringrose was cruising along the west coast of South America, a hostile continent unexplored by the English. They were so short on water because they lacked friendly ports or unsettled locations to refill in. Explorers like these had to be prepared for the unpredictable. Accidents could also deprive you of the water aboard. Wooden ships needed their hull below the waterline cleaned several times a year, unless it grew infested with barnacles and weeds that could damage the wood or slow the ship down, burning and scraping off the infestations. When Pirate Captain Ned Lowe was cleaning his Rose pink, his men forgot to shut the gun ports. When they hove the ship down, the hold filled up with water, and the ship sank. They managed to get away in a smaller vessel, but with most of the provisions lost with the ship, they had to survive on a meager ration of half a pint per day. Most infamously, the water on a ship would eventually grow rancid. As mentioned in the first minutes of the video, water needs to keep moving to avoid becoming comely to bugs and bacteria. Stagnant water is a perfect breeding ground. However, it can still be kept clean if the container is sterile. Plastic is sterile and glass is sterile, but pirates didn't have plastic, and though they did have glass bottles, keeping enough glass bottles of water to sustain the crew for any significant voyage would have been expensive and heavy. So water was kept in large wooden casks. These were a perfect breeding ground for the creepy crawlies, both because they were basically never clean enough to not introduce contaminants, but also because the water itself was seldom clean enough. Even if it was safe to drink at the time of collection, airborne microbes would be introduced that would, given time, develop. Water could grow bad within just a few days, and after a few months, might be completely undrinkable. The Swedish Maritime Museum of Karlskrona conducted a test in which they kept drinking water in a barrel for 3 months. The result was a brown, foul-smelling liquid with unidentified objects floating around in it. Ugh. When they tested the water in a lab, it was so contaminated that it was difficult to measure, and some of the equipment even broke. They could conclude that the water contained traces of dead plants and insects, and more than 620 times more mold than what is permitted in modern drinking water. You wanna try it? Many are the period accounts of encounters with foul water. Sometimes they would broach open a barrel, and a swarm of insects would emerge. Water might have to be poured through a cloth to filter out the dead bugs, and some would drink it through clenched teeth. Though some might be able to stomach the contaminated slop, many would succumb to stomach diseases that might bereave them of their life. Dysentery was a very big problem, and crapping yourself to death is not a fun way to go. Many have tried to find methods in which pirates and sailors might have sanitized the foul water. Silver has antimicrobial properties, and it has been proposed that they put silver coins in the water for this purpose. Whilst I've seen some limited documentation of it being done in the early 17th century, I am uncertain how widespread the practice was, if at all. Silver was the most common type of coinage stolen by pirates, but they preferred to spend it instead of putting it in barrels. To keep so much water clean, you would have needed a lot of coins. It has also been proposed that alcohol was used to disinfect the water. This idea mostly stems from the presence of grog, a beverage invented around 1741 by Admiral Vernon, alias Old Grog, for the grogram cloak he was known to wear. Vernon noticed how his sailors would often store up their rum rations, and then drink it all at once to get plastered. Since this was dangerous both to the men and the ship, Vernon put up a no fun allowed sign and diluted the rum rations with water, to a ratio of 4:1. The amount of liquid provided was still the same, as in, quite small. It was not done to purify the water, but to weaken the alcohol, and it wouldn't have been enough to hydrate a man for a day. Sailing was hard and the lifestyle dreary, so liquor was one of the few pleasures a sailor had. Rum, and then grog, was issued to keep the men in line, not to hydrate. It also appears that adding water to the rum made the drink spoil after a few days, preventing the sailors from hoarding their grog and drinking it all in a stupor. They had to consume it as soon as it was served. This also puts to bed the stereotype of pirates drinking grog. They drank alcohol specifically to get drunk. The idea of diluting their precious rum would probably have pissed them off, and most of their companies had very poor discipline. Their favorite beverage was punch, a mix of rum, water, sugar and lime juice. The ratio of water was probably lower than in grog, and the result is something akin to Cuba Libre. There is nothing in period literature to suggest that sailors would commonly mix alcohol into their water to purify it. The closest is an account from the late 16th century, when a surgeon encountered two scurvy-riddled sailors. These men had been forced to subsist on rotten bread, beer as sour as vinegar, stinking water, with the best drink they had being beverage, a drink of half wine and half putrefied water. But this in small allowances, and note how it was only considered the best, not good, when compared to all of the other horrible things. The wine might only have been mixed into the putrefied water simply to improve the taste. Alcohol was used as an antiseptic since the 14th century, but it isn't entirely certain if people knew that alcohol could be used to disinfect water before germ theory. Here it must be noted that alcohol isn't especially effective at purifying water. For one, the alcohol needs to be very strong, above 60%, to effectively kill most microorganisms. Rum in the Pirate Age was typically very strong, around 70%, but other common alcohols like brandy often sat at below 60. Even then, alcohol is unable to kill all microorganisms, and is nowadays not recommended as a disinfectant. There is an incident from a pirate company, recorded by William Dampier, which simply proves that pirates did not commonly use alcohol to disinfect water. The pirates were sailing in a small fleet, where the commander, Captain Townley, distributed his wine and brandy some to every ship, that it might be drank out, because he wanted the jars to carry water in. Here we can see that Townley did not keep some wine or brandy to disinfect the water, but emptied the alcohol entirely so as to fill up with pure, fresh water. Neither was beer used to replace fresh water. Surely, beer was brought aboard, and on English vessels, every seaman could expect a whole gallon. However, as aforementioned, what made beer safer was that it had been boiled, and the alcoholic content was too low to prohibit bacterial growth. Beer can be preserved for a very long period. In the history of the Royal Society of London is documented a voyage of the 1660s, during which several casks of beer were buried in a hole 10 feet deep. When the beer was recovered 8 months later, it was still drinkable. However, once you open the barrel, the beer is doomed to spoil, and in a hot climate like the tropics, you might not even need to open them. Pirate culture might also have looked down on beer and small beer, as it was too weak to satisfy them. Charles Johnson wrote a memorable anecdote of how a group of pirates hosted a theatrical trial. In this trial, the pirate playing the prisoner was condemned for allegedly drinking small beer. The pirate playing the judge claimed that there was never a sober fellow but what was a rogue, and that lawful men only drank proper rum. Johnson also documented how Bartholomew Roberts, pirate captain and a known abstainer, did also consume beer. In other regions, like the Mediterranean, beer was replaced with wine. Wine is different from beer in that it is produced by fermenting grapes, and was never boiled. Its alcoholic content seems to have been stronger than period beer, but still weaker than modern wine. It was also common to dilute wine with water, and if improperly storaged, it could expire after a few days. Neither beer nor wine was safe from infection. Seaman Edward Barlow complained of sour wine that lay many men low with the flux. As for bad beer, the worst incident was documented by Admiral Edward Russell in 1689. No longer ago than yesterday, in several of the butts of beer, great heaps of stuff was found at the bottom of the butts, not unlike men's guts, which has alarmed the seamen to a strange degree. Of course, alcohol does contain water, and can hydrate to some extent. In the Indian Ocean, the pirate crew of Richard Taylor were forced to ration their water to 1 bottle a day. They also had arrack aboard, a palm wine, and according to a prisoner of the pirates, they would have died of thirst had it not been for this liquor. Even still, alcohol is diuretic, meaning that it makes you want to urinate more. When you urinate, you expend water, and thus you have to drink more. In the end, alcohol was drunk alongside the water aboard ships, and though it did hydrate to some degree, it was primarily drunk for pleasure. The one remarkable method I've found of pirates purifying shipboard water comes from the account of William Fennell, a buccaneer, and it is somewhat unexpected. He documents how the pirates acquired water which was very muddy, and the top growing with lemnoidii, also known as duckweed. At first they removed the weed, but the ship's surgeon told them not to, saying it would preserve the water. The surgeon was correct. Duckweed is still used today to clean water, because it eliminates virtually all pollution by removing nitrogen and phosphates from the water. Was this a trick known only by this one surgeon, or was this a well-known fact among ship surgeons in the period? Fennell and his fellows did not know of it, so it certainly can't have been a widespread technique. Either way, it shows that there were water purification tricks, and there may have been other ones practiced in individual cases that we do not know of. So why didn't they just boil the water? Like I said previously, boiling water to purify it did not become widespread until the advent of germ theory in the mid-19th century. Perhaps some people before then knew that boiled water was safer to drink, but it would have been too impractical to do so aboard a sail ship to convince any captain to consider it. For one, you would have to boil massive quantities of water every day. This would require space in the cookroom, the ship's kitchen, which was limited. It could typically just house a single big cauldron, which Cookie kept stewing all day around to keep the boys fed. Sailors did not eat all at once, but in shifts throughout the day. So the cauldron was pretty much always cooking or full of food. Boiling water would also require additional firewood, which would take up space, weight, and needed time to be collected, all of which was limited. So constantly boiling the large quantities of water needed to sustain the crew would have been taxing, without the men possibly even knowing of the benefits. We've already clarified that seawater was unfit for drinking. But what about urine? You won't find any doctor recommending the consumption of urine, since it often contains toxic substances and waste the body is trying to get rid of, not to mention excess salt. The kidneys are unable to generate urine less salty than seawater, but it's still going to contain enough salt to increase dehydration. Drinking urine thus makes you thirstier, creating a nasty loop where you need to drink more and more. This doesn't mean that sailors didn't drink urine or seawater, and some documented the results. They got thirstier and thirstier with every drink, and eventually, many flat out perished. However, urine still had its purposes on a ship. It was good for cleaning the powder residue out of firearms, for example. Raveneau de Lussan documented how he and his crew used it to clean their wounds. I'm not sure if they did it directly from the source or if they had it in like bottles or cups or something. And I'm kinda glad that he didn't tell us. It could also be used in a torture method where you forcefully poured urine down someone's throat, as seen in this image. And don't even think about drinking bilge water. The bilge is the lowest compartment of the ship, and since any wooden ship was always leaking to some degree, it would all amass in the bottom. Most of it was pumped out throughout the day, but some might be kept for the sake of balance or for putting out fires. Since the bilge was at the bottom of the ship, it would also be where all of the filth of the vessel would seep down. The result was something absolutely horrifying. One sailor wrote how, "This night 2 of our carpenter's crew being sent down to search the well were struck dead with the damp, as they call it, but being hoisted up again speedily, they recovered with much difficulty. The occasion of these damps is the tightness of the ship, and lying still a long time, the bilge water corrupts and stanks, so that it is enough to poison the devil, and all the little plate and silver hath been turned black with the vapours of our bilge water in a night's time." This video has focused entirely just on covering the water aboard a pirate ship, and some of the problems with it. We still need to talk about methods in which new water was collected, and where the water was kept, barrels, and the guy who made them. These topics will be covered in 2 future episodes, but since they are all related, I will eventually slap all of them together into one larger episode. In these episodes, I will also try to answer any questions you have regarding drinking water, purification, storage, collection, whatever it may be. Speaking about questions, I also intend to have a Q&A video in December, so if you have any questions directed towards me, the channel, or anything in general, Feel free to post them in the comments or by email or the Discord, and I will see if I can answer it in the December video. Until then. A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique. Or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below. Otherwise, support Golden Gunpowder by liking the video, giving your thoughts on the video, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. Monetarily by buying some merch or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free, and sponsor-free access to my videos.